really what we need to do is, rather than always seeing ourselves as front and center stage, to have some humility, I guess, and to understand that really our role at this point is essentially to undo the damage we have done that prevents ecosystems from restoring themselves, and then just to let that happen.
Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today's guest on the newscast is sculptor and rewilding practitioner Eoghan Daltun. And for the past 14 years, he's been rewilding 75 acres of land on the Beara Peninsula, County Cork, Ireland, to much success. An experience he's documented in his book, An Irish Atlantic Rainforest, a personal journey into the magic of rewilding. Daltun speaks with Rachel Donald about his journey and why he decided to sell his property in Dublin and purchase this land in the Beara Peninsula, and also the quite miraculous emergence of a variety of flora that he says he didn't know existed in the region before he began his project. Ireland, similarly to the UK, has experienced heavy deforestation over the course of several millennia and is among the more ecologically denuded nations in the world. Daltun details some of this history and also the cultural experiences that have influenced the way people in Ireland connect with the land. He also offers an honest yet hopeful perspective on where he thinks humanity could rethink its relationship with nature. With that said, enjoy the conversation.
Eoghan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rachel. It's a real pleasure to be on. Thank you for having me.
Well, we are delighted to have you because you are such a success story. What you've done in your wee bit of the world is amazing. And I'm so pleased to be able to tell the Mongabay listeners about it today. So before we get into sort of the nitty-gritty bit of the nature, how did this come about? How did a man just sort of get up one day and go, nah, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to rewild a section of a peninsula.
Yeah, so it was a long time in the making, really. I mean, I was living in Dublin, and I guess I was unsatisfied with the life I had there, in particular in relation to my connection with the natural world. I wanted another life where I had a stronger relationship with nature and with the seasons and the planet we live on, essentially. But it took a long time to come about because I went off to live in Italy for 7 years. So, you know, I guess the process matured over, I would say, it was more than a decade, probably about 12 years. And I don't think there was any harm in that, that I was mulling over it for so long, because it kind of gave me plenty of time to think about what I was looking for and what was less important to me, you know. And it also gave me time to understand, because at the start of that journey, the idea that I had was to do essentially what I had already done in Dublin, which was I planted a whole bunch of native trees on this small plot of land I had there. And for all the years that I was living in Italy, one of the greatest joys of coming home to Ireland was to see how the trees were getting on, how they'd progressed since the previous summer, because I'd come home for a couple of months every summer. And so, you know, from there, in a sense, germinated the idea of doing the same, but on a much, much bigger scale, because properties in Dublin are just worth a lot more. So I knew I'd be able to sell this tiny little place and buy a good big chunk of land somewhere out west, you know. But having all of that time to kind of look at where I might want to live, I realized that if I was lucky, I may not need to plant any trees at all, because what I discovered in places like the Beara Peninsula, which is where I ended up in the southwest of Ireland, any pieces of land that have been left unfarmed for a significant length of time very often have reverted naturally back to wild native forests. And once I started seeing this, I started to realize that something like that would be so much better than actually planting trees, because these are wild trees and they're seeding themselves and spontaneously creating an ecosystem the way that ecosystems have done that since the beginning of such things on Earth.
It's such a beautiful story, and there's so much I would like to pick out just from that alone. This section of the beginning, I mean, this sense of a calling for stewardship, for care, wanting to get past the binary of man and nature. And I think what really strikes me in this is this bit at the end of this story, that you didn't have to go out and plant trees, that essentially that stewardship could be almost like providing a womb, if you will, setting up what was necessary in order to protect the land, give it enough space and time in order to do what it does best. And I think that that's such a beautiful and gentle philosophy, and quite contrary to a lot of policies, climate, environmental policies that we see now. They're still really anthropomorphic in their philosophy, which is that, they want to put man front and center of healing the earth, when in fact the earth needs to be respected. And sometimes that respect is leaving it alone.
Yeah, 100%, Rachel. I think it's something that's so people really struggle with, is just the idea that the earth isn't just a kind of a playground or a kind of a backdrop for us to play out our fantasies, whether that is wrecking nature and the earth or trying to reverse that really what we need to do is, rather than always seeing ourselves as front and center stage, to have some humility, I guess, and to understand that really our role at this point is essentially to undo the damage we have done that prevents ecosystems from restoring themselves, and then just to let that happen. And I think people have difficulty with that, because as a species, we're kind of gardeners, we're kind of manipulators of our environments. I think our success as a species, success in inverted commas, is largely predicated on our capacity to come into an environment and start manipulating it. And I guess the highest expression of that, in a sense, is farming, where we come into a natural ecosystem and remove that to make way for something that produces food or whatever else for our needs and our benefit. And as you rightly say, with the knowledge that we've taken that so far now, a lot of people have been unable to understand that turning that around requires a complete change of philosophy to one of just removing the artificial obstacles that we have placed. So my place is a good example of that. So essentially, the farm that I bought on the Beara Peninsula in southwest Ireland, what attracted me to it was the fact that the family who had lived here in the past had mostly emigrated in the early 20th century to the United States, as so many people in this part of Ireland did, for economic reasons. And the result of that was the fact that the land wasn't really being farmed. They had a couple of cattle, but there was nothing serious happening. So any wild native trees and all of the associated biodiversity was able to start spreading back out and recolonizing the land. So the land spontaneously began to turn back into a most beautiful native forest. And what I later came to realize was actually the rainforest. I didn't know it when I came here. I didn't know there was such a thing as rainforest in Ireland. I don't think anybody really did in Ireland. However, that process, which had been going on for about 100 years of what we might call rewilding now, through neglect, for the previous decade or two before I came down, had been interrupted and blocked by a couple of factors. The first one was severe overgrazing by invasive species in the form of feral goats and Sika deer. So both species they're both non-native, they were both introduced, but extremely disruptive to native ecosystems in Ireland, like our native rainforest, because they eat every last tree seedling that germinates, and they clear out all of the really rich ground flora that you should have in a forest like this. They just clear it all out. But the most negative effect is that preventing the forest from regenerating. So over time, the forest will just die away. And that's what was exactly what was happening to this place when I arrived. That overgrazing also creates the ideal conditions for takeover by a whole bunch of non-native invasive plant species. And there's one in particular that in all up the west coast of Ireland and in other parts of the country is a real scourge. It's killing off native forests, and it's Rhododendron ponticum. It's the same. There's a similar problem in parts of Wales and Scotland and other places.
This plant is also known as the common rhododendron, and it's native to the Iberian Peninsula. Interestingly enough, it used to occur in Great Britain prior to the last ice age, but has since been reintroduced by humans.
So really what I found here was this incredibly beautiful wild native forest, but it was in absolute ecological meltdown when I arrived. And it's important to state that what was causing that were man-made factors. So those invasive grazers, it's not just the fact that they were introduced here by people. It's also the fact that people here in Ireland, we killed off all of the apex predators that would control the numbers and behavior of any grazers, whether wild or whether native or non-native, allowing them to kind of absolutely their numbers to surge and to destroy ecosystems in that way. So what I did was I applied for a grant under a scheme called the Native Woodland Scheme to put up a fence to fence out the goats and the sika. And in the meantime, while that was working its way through the kind of bureaucratic process, which took about a year and a half, I set to work getting rid of the rhododendron. There were about 7 or 8 other invasive plant species there as well. After a year and a half, the application for funding for the fence was approved, and contractors came in and put up a 6-foot high, a 2-meter high fence around most of the land. And the result of all of this was just absolutely stunningly spectacular. The whole place just absolutely started to erupt with wildflowers that I had presumed didn't exist. I just thought there weren't any of these things because I hadn't seen any sign of them. Bluebell, wood anemone, primrose, wood sorrel, dog violet, and scores more all just erupted the following spring across the woodland floor. But also you started to get little tree seedlings popping up everywhere almost immediately. So what's happened is that because that fence was erected now about 12 and a half years ago. So there's been a process of full-on succession, natural succession in the land now for that long. And in areas where previously you just had barren grasses, you now have closed canopy, extremely biodiverse rainforest. And it's been such a joy to see that happen. I feel very privileged to have been witness and to have played a part. And I still do. I was just in there only half an hour ago, pottering about for a while. And it's a real joy, as I say, you know.
God, it's so, I feel like I could sit and listen to you talk about this for hours. You can really hear the love and the land in your voice, the way that you speak about it.
There really are no words that I can use that can adequately describe the transformations that I've witnessed. And it's important to say as well that as part of that, it hasn't just been in terms of the flora, this kind of renaissance. It's also lots of quite rare mammals have moved in. You've had pine martens have moved in, lesser horseshoe bats, and otters have kind of started to come up the streams, and all sorts of rare invertebrates, and it's been absolutely just fantastic to see to see essentially an ecosystem recompose itself where previously there wasn't one, you know.
In 12 years as well, it is really the blink of an eye, even in sort of human terms. It's astonishing, the turnaround.
It is, yeah. And I think the important thing, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is that when we need to move beyond imagining that everything should happen in human timeframes. It's so easy to get into this kind of mindset of, well, you know, you've got your checklist and your kind of timetable, and it should all happen within such and such a date. You should expect this or whatever else. Whereas really, what we need to be doing is just allowing nature to take over, and nature does stuff at its own speed, which can be very, very quickly, or it can be less quickly, or something in between, or you know, it might shift to a completely other state, which isn't rainforest at all. And that's part of the beauty of it, is that you just don't know what's going to happen where. It's all a continual surprise.
I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between land and language recently. And this idea that divorcing a people from their land divorces them from their language, which then divorces them from their mind. And it's Jay Griffiths, who I'm interviewing in a couple of weeks, that speaks really eloquently about this. And so this sense of coming back to the land also as a way to reappropriate our own culture. And I think for Scottish and Irish people, this is particularly prescient, let's say, because that colonization is still very present in both nations, and particularly for the Irish people was absolutely bloody and brutal, and still sometimes is bloody and brutal up until this day. And so can you speak a little bit to this sense as well of what that land as Ireland means to be Irish, and how letting nature kind of get on with it can perhaps also be mirrored in the sense of letting a local people get on with it by sort of becoming indigenous again to where they are from?
Wow. So there's a lot in there, you know. It's I could literally speak for a couple of hours just about all that, and I wouldn't have time to
I'd love it.
to get. It's so complex, you know. I mean, as you so rightly say, Ireland and Scotland have an awful lot in common. I've been over to Scotland a couple of times in the last couple of years, invited by a rewilding organization there called Scotland, the Big Picture, who are absolutely brilliant. They're a fantastic outfit. And it's been a real revelation to me. Scotland and Ireland, there are so many parallels in terms of landscape. Very often in Scotland, if it weren't for the accents of the people with me, I could be in Ireland, you know. And the ecology as well. The ecology is incredibly similar, and the culture and the history, the history of colonization and dispossession very, very, very analogous. I think there are important differences as well. And when it comes to something like rewilding, which I'm a huge advocate of, the most obvious difference is there's the incredibly concentrated land ownership patterns that you have in Scotland, where less 500 people own more than half of the land in the country. So in Ireland, it's quite different. In Scotland, that allows fantastic things to happen very quickly in ecological terms, because you can get some rich billionaire who can come in and buy a 70,000 acre estate and start rewilding it from the very next day. But in social terms, it's far from ideal, because it creates this kind of divide between rich people who can do these things as a kind of nearly like a kind of a hobby, and everybody else who becomes a kind of a spectator, people might think what's happening is fantastic, but I think it's, there are real downsides to people being excluded from that process. I think ideally social justice and ecological justice need to go hand in hand. But to go back to your question about the relationship with the land and so on, in Ireland, I guess the process of dispossession, one of the things that I did when I came down here was I got really interested in the ecological history of this part of Ireland. And that obviously required understanding all other aspects of history, the people history, if you like, because the two are so closely entwined. And I thought I had a good idea of Irish history and how brutal that process of colonization and subjugation by England, the imperial power, was, but I actually didn't. It was far worse than I thought. And we're hearing a lot of the word genocide in this moment of history. And I think that word can be justifiably applied to various instances of Irish history in areas like the Beara Peninsula, where I am. At certain times, there was essentially a policy of just killing all native Irish people in the area. And as I say, the people, particularly in the Cromwellian period, so you're talking about 1650s there, the native Irish landowners were put off the land. Their land was confiscated and given out to soldiers, essentially, in lieu of pay. They didn't, the authorities didn't have enough to pay all the soldiers who'd come to Ireland to fight, so they gave them land instead. And that started a process in which, for the following couple of centuries, life was pretty horrendous for most people in Ireland. And a lot of it came back to that dispossession from the land. So, for example, between 1845 and 1852, you had what was called An Gorta Mór, which translates as the Great Hunger, and it's otherwise known as the Great Famine. And in this area, for example, in the townland, so this farm that I bought is divided between two different townlands. And in one of them, over 50% of people either died or left during that period. And in the other one, almost 75% of people either died or left. And it's generally estimated that where you have a population collapse like that during the famine, about half of the people would have managed to emigrate and the other half just died. And that was because people didn't own their land. People were surviving on tiny little pieces of land of maybe only a quarter of an acre or less, and were therefore of rented land, by the way. They didn't even own that. And they were therefore heavily dependent on potatoes. And when the potato blight struck, there was nothing for people to eat. And Ireland was full of food at the time. There were plenty of cargo boats leaving loaded up with food, often under armed guard. But
here, Eoghan's audio becomes quite difficult to hear, but he describes that just before the Great Famine struck, people were incredibly dependent on potatoes as a food source. The scourge blighted their food source. But there was still lots of food in Ireland. People just couldn't afford it. And 1 million people died during the period. Another million immigrated to Canada and the United States. While this tragic famine is probably the most well-known in Irish history, Eoghan says many similar events occurred after it, and some of them were brought on by the British military, who had a scorched earth policy, wiping out crops to stifle Irish resistance.
You got the development of this psyche where the land was seen as the be-all and end-all for a lot of people. I think that still exists in our minds. And I think to some degree, that may have even informed my own journey in some kind of subliminal level. Was this hunger for a piece of land. And so towards the end of the 19th century, there was what's referred to as the land war, where tenant farmers, because everybody was a tenant farmer, that the land, vast swathes of land were owned by the descendants of English colonists, and they rented out the land to these small tenant farmers who had no security of tenure. They were often put out of their homes and evicted and so on. And so you had this land war where people struggled for rights to their land and eventually gained the right to buy out their own land. So if you start talking about the relationship between land and Irish people, it's something that's incredibly deep and incredibly strong. A neighbour of mine, or I've heard it said here in Ireland, that in places like this, you'll hear people say that land is like a religion to some people. And if you know anything about the hold that religion and the Catholic Church had in this country up until very recently, you'll understand what something like that means. But it's a kind of a funny thing, because attachment to land does not mean attachment to nature. Totally the opposite very often. In places like the Beara Peninsula, life was incredibly hard up until very recently, and nature wasn't seen as something that had any worth. So you went from this connection, I think, without romanticizing things. If you go back in time to the pre-colonial period, I think there would have been quite a rich relationship with nature and with the natural world. And a good example of that could be the wolf, for example. So the wolf in Irish was called Mongabay, which means son of the land. And there was a very respectful relationship with the wolf amongst people here in Ireland. But the colonial authorities had a very different attitude. Their attitude was one of subjugation, not just of people, native people, but also the land and the fauna, including wild animals like wolves. So we have accounts left from the early 1600s, for example, from one of the most famous of these kind of colonialists, a guy called Sir Richard Boyle, who said, when I arrived here at the start of the 17th century, this was all just a kind of a big wilderness, and I've turned it into something that's akin to a piece of southern England. And that kind of sums up the mindset of the time. But where we're at now is that people in Ireland have, because nature has been driven out to such an extent, and it's hard to overstate how badly off nature is on this island. It really is one of the most nature trashed places on earth at this stage. And people have lost that connection. So, as I was saying, places like the Beara Peninsula were really tough places to survive for people up until around the 1970s, 80s, thereabouts. And nature was seen as something that you fought against to wrestle a living from the land. So there's no appreciation of, or very, very little appreciation of nature now. And so, talk about reintroducing wolves, and other apex predators, which would help resolve problems like what I faced when I arrived here, and with the goats and the sika deer overgrazing the forest, there'd be massive resistance to reintroducing wolves or other apex predators. And so it's quite complex and tricky.
Yes, I think that it so clearly speaks to the tricky and complex relationship we have with ourselves as a species and not quite knowing our place. And how could we know our place having been so ferociously dispossessed ourselves, both in a history and now this sort of continual self-dispossession, which is what comes from the necessity to exist in a kind of hyper-connected, technologized, globalized world that doesn't focus on this relationship to who we are, where we're from, and leaving a footprint that matters, the kind of footprint through which seedlings can push up their first reach to the sun, not the kind of footprint that leaves ash behind.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I think that it's really important to explore how early colonialism and what you're looking at there is the beginnings of capitalism, really, as well.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to explore how these changes shifted and altered our relationship with the natural world, and to be cognizant of that. But at the same time, I think in my view, we also have to be completely honest with ourselves and realize that the damage didn't start with the arrival of colonial regimes, that Indigenous people, well, certainly in Ireland, and I think in other parts of the world, were doing damage, not on the same scale, because there was a different culture and the technologies weren't so advanced. So the potential for damaging nature was lower. But if you look, for example, at this part of the world, so it's estimated that if you go back to Mesolithic times, so before farming, around 80% of Ireland would have been forested with all sorts of different, it wouldn't have been uniform. That forest would have been highly diverse and all sorts of different types.
Mesolithic is also sometimes referred to as the Middle Stone Age, and this occurred 15,000 to 5,000 years before the present or before the Common Era.
And the other 20% of Ireland would have been other types of wild natural habitats, from bogs to other types of wetlands and lakes and more open areas. But 100% of the island would have been wild native habitat. Before the really intense colonial period, which for that we can use the year 1600 as a kind of a peg marker. And it's estimated that by 1600, so before that last period of really destructive colonial related kind of ecocide kicked in, most of Ireland was already open. We don't know exactly how much, but it was probably, it's somewhere in between about 87.5% and 98% was already open. So that happened. That was people doing that by themselves without it being pushed by a colonial power. What really happened with colonization was that process speeded up, and the last little pieces were, to all intents and purposes, wiped out. So, farming was the biggest event in Ireland in terms of impacts on wild ecosystems. But you can even go back further. If you start to look at the Pleistocene extinctions that happened across Europe and across the world, as people spread out across the world, people have had a very impactful and a negatively impactful. When we arrived in a place, we radically changed nature and made it poorer by wiping out the megafauna everywhere we went, essentially. So to go back to what I was saying, I think it is important to understand how more recent changes have speeded up exponentially that process of damaging nature, but without kind of looking at what went before that with rose-tinted glasses. I think we need to be really honest with ourselves here and understand that the dysfunctional relationship that we have with nature goes very, very deep.
Owen, thank you so much. If we had more time, I have no doubt that we could continue this for hours, and I hope very much to be in conversation with you again in the future. This has just been wonderful. Thank you.
My absolute pleasure, Rachel. Thanks again for having me on.
Whenever I'm in the Highlands in Scotland, even if the weather is totally grim, you have this sense of just utter wildness and beauty that I don't find in other countries as easily. Like, I've hiked through Spain, I've hiked through France, and those countries are really beautiful, and it's such a pleasure to be out in them and to either be at the sea looking up at the mountains or be in the mountains looking out over the range and down to the sea. But in Scotland, there's this sense of something really wild, something really ancient with you, as if a spirit is standing next to you in the fog that is whispering to you like, you could die here, and so you have to be careful. But that sense of electric kind of life and risk and unknowingness, but also an ancient deep knowingness that's very particular, I think, to Scotland. We say that there's magic in the soil in Scotland and Ireland. Not England, but Scotland and Ireland.
Wow, that was beautiful, Rachel. That's really something, because as Eoghan was speaking, I got a similar sentiment from him about Ireland. And to my surprise, I didn't realize this, but I wanted to bring this up with you. Actually, let me see if you can guess. Guess how much of the land of Ireland is covered in native woodland?
I think I know this, and it's heartbreaking. So I believe that in the past it was upwards of about 70%, and now it's less than 1%. Is that correct?
Wow, that was exceedingly close. It was historically 80% at the end of the last ice age, and today it's 2%.
It's not good.
I did not know this. Yeah, I did not know this, and I was shocked. I was absolutely shocked. The land now has about 10% forest cover, but most of it is conifer plantations. And I found that heartbreaking, and all the more reason why this conversation with Eoghan is so critical to be having right now.
It was only through working as an environmental journalist that I came to see Scotland through very different eyes. So when you go in the north of Scotland and you go for a hike, something that's quite particular I've found is that the hills are bare, right? But they're really beautiful in a sense because of that. They're purple. The Scottish hills are purple because of all the heather. And sometimes you'll see this patch, deep red, kind of moving across the hills like a wave, and that it's in fact a herd of deer. And the lack of trees, the protrusion of the rock, the purple of the heather, it makes it this kind of scraggly, beautiful, dangerous, wild place that I was saying. But it was only through doing this work as an environmental journalist that only about 2 years ago, I was like, hold on, that's not what they're meant to look like, though. They're meant to be covered in trees and sections.
Yeah.
And they are real, sections. You will see a sort of perfect rectangle on a mountain face that's forested.
Yeah.
Normally, with these kind of monoculture plantations. And you realize, it would have actually looked very different all this time ago. It's not meant to be bare. It's meant to be rich and teeming with life.
Yeah, I mean, it was It really blew my mind to look into this more. I mean, I looked up information from the State Forestry Agency in Ireland to see how we got to this point. And much like Eoghan points out, things really started changing about 7,000 years ago during the Mesolithic period, just like he explains, and when farming became much more of a thing. But I did read that even as recently as the Middle Ages, there was still significantly more forest cover. And I sometimes just wonder what that would have been like to see the island with much more forest cover.
Oh, I think it would have been to see the island covered in spirits and witches and all of these kinds of things of lore. I really do. I think that when you're walking through, right, because like you and I have been to, we're very fortunate. We've been to like tropical rainforests and temperate rainforests, and we should maybe get into the difference as well.
Rachel and I got a little caught up in our conversation, and we didn't actually cover the difference between a tropical rainforest and a temperate one. So just a quick rundown for curious listeners. Temperate rainforests are quite simply forests in a temperate zone that receive heavy rain. Think the Great Smoky Mountains in the Appalachians in the United States, or the rainforest at Kells Bay in County Kerry, Ireland. And there are many more across the world, but generally they are characterized by their far north or far south latitudes and the heavy understory that the forest contains. Ireland definitely has them.
And like when you're walking through a tropical rainforest, I mean, it's a different kind of magical. It's a very like in your face magical. The colors and the screeching and the noises, and it's so wonderful and it's amazing and it's dangerous. And you know that it's dangerous, but it's so like intoxicating as well. It's like drinking the most delicious cocktail that might be poisonous, but you don't care if it is because it just tastes so good. Whereas walking through, walking through a temperate
That's a good way of
rainforest,
describing it. Yeah.
I think so, isn't it? I think so. All those like poisonous little colorful frogs. Whereas walking through a temperate rainforest is like, it's like walking through clouds or swimming through moss or being in a dream. It has a stillness and a kind of like ancient quality about it. I feel like you can see the age more easily in a temperate rainforest. It has this quality of old because a rainforest has this quality of like, it's old, but it's so new as well. There's just life on top of life on top of life. Whereas a temperate rainforest kind of, it's like those trees in Lord of the Rings. You know, those big wise talking ones. It's those guys. Yeah. That's the vibe.
I need to, I can't believe I can't remember their names, but I'll drop that in here.
I know. Who are they again?
They're like the walkers of, oh my God, people are gonna get angry that I don't know
right,
this.
And rightly so. We should
out.
know this.
Yeah. All right, don't hate us. The character from Tolkien's trilogy is named Treebeard, and he was an Ent, which is actually a derivative of an Old English word for giant. Something we also failed to mention is Treebeard, much like many things in The Lord of the Rings, are arguably symbols of Tolkien's own self-stated environmental ethics. He actually wrote a letter to his publisher in 1955 stating the following: "I am obviously much in love with plants, and above all, trees, and always have been, and I find human mistreatment of them as hard to bear as some find ill treatment of animals." I didn't expect to find this in my research for this episode, but I have to say it explains a lot. You know what I noticed, Rachel? There's a certain, when you're in a forest like that, there's like just certain, I don't want to use the word silence because forests are actually quite loud when you step inside of them. I just visited a tropical rainforest and it was very loud. It was teeming with life, but it was also very silent. Like there is this certain, just the trappings and also the noise of modern society are just nowhere to be found. And it definitely feels way different than the day-to-day life in not just an urban center, but like a metro or suburban area. Like it is just a different kind of atmosphere.
Yeah, I totally agree. This kind of peace and quiet. And I think it's because all of the noises are working in tandem to produce this symphony of life. And They might be surprising from time to time. A cheeky little monkey might have a chatter near you, even though you can't see it in a tropical rainforest. But that's part of how everything is meant to be. Nothing's out of place. Whereas I think so many of the noises that we hear in our modern life, in modern society, progressive society, industrialized society, are noises that are meant to indicate like the arrival of a thing quite like individualistically. And what I mean by that is like the car horn that says like, get out of my way, or the motorbike revving, which says, I am here and I am ready to do X. Even in a lot of cities, you will hear the loudest pitch of voices, not with laughter, not with people like raucously telling a story, or people yelling at each other. So the sense of like disconnect is if ever there's so much noise because all of these machines are working independently rather than working together like a forest to create music, really.
And so this actually brought up a question for me that I wasn't expecting to like have after listening to this episode, but I'm really curious to hear what you think about it. And Eoghan validly brings up this point that it can be tempting sometimes to look on the past with rose-colored glasses and for us to not be honest with ourselves about when ecological destruction starts. And in some ways, he seemed to be suggesting here, and correct me if I'm wrong or if you got a different take, but he seemed to suggest to me here that industrialization, modernization of agriculture ushered in just a speed up of destruction that already was occurring on a smaller scale. And I found that difficult to grapple with. I personally was a little bit shook by that. Because if you look at Ireland, you can't really deny that was the case. And I don't know what there is to learn from that or reconcile about it. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts.
Thanks for bringing that up, Mike. I thought that it was a good point, that it's not as if everything in the world was fine and then the advent of, or the beginnings of capitalism ruined everything. Like the seeds of capitalism were sown a very long time. And from the anthropologists and like economic anthropologists that I've spoken to, they refer to the fact that prior to capitalism were hundreds of years of feudalism. And so this sense of private property, of landowner and serf, or upper class and peasant, this hierarchy that split man and split nature from himself, that some researchers suggest actually began 10,000 years ago with the agricultural revolution, that can explain a lot of this environmental destruction. I personally think that any society that has a sense of private property over communal property and has a sense of like class distinction and amongst a community, and also any community that has to create a surplus in order to survive, then gets into quite a difficult philosophical relationship with nature. Like, how much do we take in order to survive? How do we guarantee that? How do we also ensure that we're still respecting it? It's not as if there is one very simple organization of humankind that we can all revert back to that will be ecologically beneficial. There were cultures that were at different points of figuring that out. And I think that very often we look to Indigenous societies that are currently still with us, thankfully, as emblems of how this is possible. And they are so important. I think another thing we have to remember, though, is that they live in very abundant places like tropical rainforests. And the Indigenous peoples of Scotland and Ireland 1,000 years ago, well, let's just say there wasn't much fruit growing off of trees. So you can understand, I think, why there was this need to why there was this perceived need to conquer the land.
Yeah. I mean, so much to think about and so much to talk about there. Those were all really great thoughts, Rachel. Thank you for sharing on that. So I think it bears repeating that the Great Famine that Eoghan speaks about, which is the most well-known one, it resulted in the deaths of 1 million people, and then 1 million more immigrated to the United States, mostly to the United States and Canada. And that was because, as he explains, they couldn't afford food. And while
Well,
potatoes were their
yeah.
primary source, they couldn't buy the food that was coming into the country.
Yeah. So it's both, right? So the food that they had been living off of had a scourge, the potato
Right.
blight of some disease. And the English did not allow them to, have food that they couldn't buy. And they couldn't buy it because they couldn't produce any of the other food that had been scourged, essentially. It's a bloody and brutal history, and one that still runs very deep in Irish culture today. And I think I don't know if anybody's watching the Irish members of the European Parliament at the moment, blasting sort of European elites for the continuation of supporting an apartheid state. But you can see, I think, that history, and you can hear it in their voices when they're on stage.
I suppose one thing we should talk about is how hopeful Eoghan's story is. Like, listening to when I sat down to edit this, I was just like, this is incredible. And I don't know how many people out there are aware of Eoghan's story, but that the thing that blew me away the most was that he didn't even know that these flowers or trees were there. They just came back, and that is how he knew that they were from there. He took out all the non-native rhododendron, and I think he said that took him about 7 or 8 years to do. And then flowers, bushes, trees that he had never seen before grew. To me, that's miraculous from my point of view, but also incredibly hopeful. It gives me a lot of hope for other perceivably denuded areas of the world.
Totally. I loved his story. I could have sat and listened to him speak about that land all day. It was like the most soothing thing I have heard all year. It was just beautiful. And I loved that his sense of stewardship was so nuanced. Like, okay, remove that which is non-native. Like, do the work, go and learn the land, read the books, and then go and do the manual labor to do that. And then put up a fence and leave the land to do its thing. And I think it's such a beautiful, like, example of how land and man, which is part of nature, works together. Like, okay, we can use this thing that we've got consciousness that, like, the Silicon Valley tech bros are obsessed with, to do a little bit of research, find out what the best thing is to do, provide some care to, like, remove certain things, and then provide the care, which is the wisdom to let a thing be, to let a thing grow, to not get in its way, to not need to put our mark on it, to not need to plant those trees. I was reading about the, like, Arctic explorers last night, and how in the 19th century, late 19th century, when a bunch of them were heading up, in the early 20th century, all the divers were talking about how they were having a really bad time, and also the fact that bad time was barely worth it because they weren't the first to be there. And, like, God, this sense of, like, this proprietary way of being even infects, like, how we see the world. Like, it's not worth seeing unless I was the first person to see it. And that's a real, like, anti-wisdom that we need to undo. And so I think stories like Eoghan really begin to shine the way of that. Like, just get out the way and let the world happen.
Well, I think that's a great place to end this on, but if you want to mention anything else, feel free. But I thought this was a great conversation, and I really hope people check out his book.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I was just wondering, Mike, if you want to, like, club together our non-existent environmental journalist assets and, like, buy a bit of a peninsula and erect a fence and let the world happen.
Yeah, I'm down.
Cool.
That sounds awesome. I want to go there and be like, look at these trees that we didn't know were here, and now they are. Because, wow, that's incredible.
I know. I think, honestly, just like a last thing, one of my favorite bits of the interview was at, like, when he said that thing, I'm like, oh, I was just out in it half an hour before. I was just out in the land half an hour before. And it's like, how beautiful. Like, he's walking through it and he knows it. He knows it like a child of his because he's watched it grow up. I just think that's amazing.
I will admit to feeling quite jealous when he said that. I was like, that sounds so nice.
I know.
But he's doing amazing work. His book is An Irish Atlantic Rainforest. Really suggest picking up a copy of that if you're interested more in Eoghan's work.
Yeah, definitely. Treat yourself.
If you want to read more on Eoghan Daltun's work, please check out his book. The link is posted in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay Newscast or any of our podcast content, like our sister series, Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work that we're doing and tell a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to help expand our reach, but you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Mongabay is a nonprofit news outlet, so even just $1 per month does make a difference, and it helps us offset production costs. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And also, you can just read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or follow us on social media. Find Mongabay via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News, and on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. And thank you, as always, for listening.